attitude to the world is scarcely favorable to science. Why bother with the workings of the world when they are nothing but an illusion? In these early days, philosophy was considered the study of all knowledge. In Greek, philosopher means lover of wisdom. Mathematics, science, and cosmology did not exist as such. For centuries they were considered part of philosophy. As late as the 17th century, Newton called his masterpiece on gravity and the workings of the universe Philosophicae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Only through the years did philosophy come to be regarded by many as the study of metaphysical, and thus unanswerable, questions. Whenever philosophy actually found the answers to questions, it ceased to be philosophy and became something else, a separate subject such as mathematics or physics. The most recent example of this is usually considered to be psychiatry, which claimed to answer a number of questions and immediately set up shop as a separate science. In fact, it does not fulfill the philosophic requirements of a science which demands a set of principles that can be tested by experiment, requirements not fulfilled by the inexactitudes of paranoia, psychoanalytic cures for dementia, and other forms of psychopathic disorder. In Socrates' time, this entire field was of course considered part of philosophy, and philosophers were popularly regarded by the citizens of Athens much as the public today regards psychiatrists. Socrates' attitude toward philosophy was certainly psychological in the original sense of the word. In Greek, psychology means the study of the mind. But he was no scientist. The influence of Parmenides saw to that. Reality was an illusion. This had a negative effect on Socrates and his successor, Plato. During their lifetime, a few significant advances were made in mathematics, but only because this was considered timeless and abstract, and thus thought to be in some way connected with the ultimate reality of being. Fortunately, their successor Aristotle had a different attitude toward the world. He became in many ways the founder of science, and drew philosophy back toward reality. But the unscientific, indeed anti-scientific attitude that developed with Socrates was to cast a blight on philosophy for centuries to come. Largely as a result of Socrates' anti-scientific attitude, the few great scientific minds of the ancient Greek world worked outside philosophy. Archimedes, in physics, Hippocrates, in medicine, and to a certain extent Euclid, in geometry, were isolated from philosophy and thus from any developing tradition of knowledge and argument. Ancient Greek scientists knew the earth went around the sun, knew it was round, and even calculated its circumference. They observed electricity, and were aware that the earth had a magnetic field. Outside the universal wisdom of philosophy, such factual bits of knowledge were isolated to the status of oddities. We owe a great deal to Socrates for placing philosophy on the sound basis of reason. But the fact that philosophy came of age under the aegis of an anti-scientist must count as one of the great misfortunes of human learning. It is difficult to overemphasize the significance of this missed opportunity. The mental energy expended in the Middle Ages calculating the number of angels who could stand on the head of a pin might instead have been dealing with the atoms first posited by Democritus. Rather than questioning the world, Socrates believed we would be better off questioning ourselves. He adopted the celebrated maxim, "Gnote seton," know thyself. This saying is sometimes erroneously attributed to Socrates. In fact, it may well have been coined by the first philosopher of all, Thales. It is also known to have been inscribed at the Delphic oracle. Socrates began expounding his philosophy in the Agora, the marketplace of ancient Athens, whose extensive ruins are still visible beneath the Acropolis. Socrates' favorite spot here was the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherius, a shady colonnade lined with stall-holders selling wares. The stone foundations of this stoa can still be traced quite plainly. They are truncated at their northern end by the busy Athens-Piraeus metro, and from beyond the nearby wire fence, the calm of the ruins is shattered by the clamoring throng, blaring bouzouki tapes, and bawling stall-holders of the Monastiraki flea market. All this cannot be very different from the uproar that must have prevailed in Socrates' day. We have to imagine Socrates conducting his philosophic business amidst the ancient equivalent of haggling jeans merchants, ghetto blasters blaring Zorba the Greek, and the plaintive cries of peanut vendors. Yet in spite of this, someone must have actually heard what he had to say. And the young Socrates must have caused a stir in Athens, for by the time he was 30, the Delphic oracle pronounced him the wisest of men. Socrates said he found this difficult to believe, disingenuously claiming that, "I know nothing except the fact of my own ignorance." In order to discover whether there was any truth in the oracle's pronouncement, Socrates set about questioning the other wise men of Athens, trying to discover what they knew. Socrates was a past master at exposing cant and erroneous beliefs. He would claim he knew nothing and demand of his adversary precisely what it was that he knew. While his adversary explained, Socrates would prick the bubble of his illusions by asking pointed questions. Not for nothing did Socrates become known as the gadfly of Athens. But his method of questioning was much more profound than it often at first appeared. Socrates would seek to clarify the debate by starting from first principles. This meant defining the basic concepts upon which his adversary's ideas rested, exposing inconsistencies, and particularly pointing out the consequences of such ideas. But Socrates also had a keen eye for human absurdity, and was not above reducing his adversary to a laughing stock. Judging from all accounts, he must have been an infuriating conversational opponent, slippery, brilliant, and devious. And there's no doubt that this smart-aleck aspect of Socrates' character earned him more than a few enemies, as well as gaining him a popular following among the iconoclastic youth of his day. It wasn't long before Socrates had demonstrated to his own satisfaction that the so-called wise men of Athens, in fact, knew nothing, just like him. So he concluded that the Delphic oracle had been right. He was the wisest man, because he knew that he knew nothing. Socrates may have been rational and iconoclastic in his approach, but in certain ways he remained very much a creature of his age. Despite all the banter, Socrates seems to have believed that the Delphic oracle spoke with the voice of the gods. He also firmly believed that the soul is immortal and imperishable, and after death our souls continue to exist in another world. Although most of the time he held little truck with superstitious reverence for the gods and the soap opera of their mythology, he certainly believed there was a god of some sort. The reason he gave for this was that everyone appeared to believe in a god of some sort, a curious reason coming from someone who spent his life trying to disabuse people of erroneous thought processes. But Socrates' philosophy was not all concerned with thought processes and analytical method. It also put forward a number of positive proposals, which means he may well have had to endure a taste of his own critical medicine on occasion. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, the character Socrates puts forward a theory of forms. Many consider this to be Plato's own theory, which he is merely expressing through the mouthpiece of Socrates. But when Plato wrote the Phaedo, all the other characters who appear in this dialogue were still alive. It can thus be assumed that unless Plato wished to spend a lot of his time in the courts, the views put forward by these characters are what they actually believed, and as such they are likely to have discussed them with the actual Socrates. Having based so much of the dialogue on factual sources, it seems unlikely that Plato would then have introduced a fictitious Socrates spouting views he never held. Plato also stresses that Socrates frequently put forward these values. Despite such evidence, the theory of forms is usually attributed to Plato. All this goes to show the difficulty of attributing anything to someone who doesn't write anything down, perhaps one reason why so many of us cleverly adopt this ploy. One thing is certain about the theory of forms: neither Socrates nor Plato was the first to think of it. This feat is generally credited to Pythagoras. As we have seen, Pythagoras' studies of musical harmony led him to believe that the world was ultimately made up of numbers. But Pythagoras' conception of numbers was in many ways closer to our notion of form. According to Pythagoras, these abstractions, number, form, were the ultimate reality. They were the changeless abstract ideas from which the concrete, ever-changing particulars of the world were formed. As is evident, this also echoes Parmenides' idea of the ultimate reality consisting of being, the ultimate entity that gives rise to the bits and pieces of our illusory world. In the Phaedo, Socrates describes the nature of the world of forms, or numbers, or ideas. The Greek word he uses is eidos. This is the generic root of our word idea, and it can variously be translated as form, idea, or figure, where the notion of number and form actually coincide. According to Socrates, the world of forms is not accessible to our senses only to thought. We can think of such ideas as roundness and redness, but we do not perceive them. We only perceive a particular red ball. This is created out of the ideas of redness, roundness, elasticity, and so on. But how is this done? According to Socrates, particular objects receive their qualities by participating in the ideas from which they derive. One way of explaining this is to use the image of a plaster cast being made out of a mold. The abstract forms or ideas, the mold, give the particular object its shape, size, and other qualities. The world of forms is the only real world and is universal. It is the ultimate world in which all particular things participate. This world of forms has a hierarchy which rises to a peak in such universal ideas as good, beauty, and truth. The qualities of goodness, beauty, and truth that we become aware of in particular objects lead us to contemplate these universal ideas in their abstract realm. This is a mystical attitude toward the world. It echoes the Indian thought from which it may well ultimately have derived, where the world is seen as the illusory veil of Maya, which to the good man is transparent. For Socrates, these universal ideas are seen as superior to the world which first causes us to become aware of them. Fortunately, such a woolly system of thought, which scorns the particularity of the world we inhabit, is not entirely without precision. Number being synonymous with these higher ideas, the study of number becomes a superior pursuit. Thus, mathematics was viewed by the Greeks as an enlightening activity, though only in its pure form. Calculating the sum of the angles of a polygon was quite acceptable. Working out the number of buckets needed to fill a tank of water was definitely infra D. This would have been practical. That is, it might have proved useful in the grubby world of particulars which we are forced to inhabit. Inevitably, such an attitude viewed science as beyond the pale. This attitude was to persist throughout Western culture, and elements of it are still detectable even today. Socrates grew up in the age of Pericles, when Athens was the strongest and most civilized city-state in the Hellenic world. Its advances influenced the entire course of human development. Besides its more concrete monuments, this era also witnessed the flowering of democracy as well as the consolidation of genuine mathematical and scientific thinking, and with Socrates it marked the coming of age of philosophy. The era of comparative peace that had marked the Periclean age came to an end with the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. This ruinous struggle between the quasi-democratic naval empire of Athens and Philistine militaristic Sparta continued for more than a quarter of a century. The war and its political repercussions played a continuing and crucial role in Socrates' life. It is worth remembering that what now appears to us as boringly sane and reasonable in his philosophy was conceived against an ever-changing background of bigotry, chicanery, and fear. Socrates' search for personal truth was conducted in an age of changing values and ebbing certainties, whose moral climate we would find all too recognizable. Upon the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was called to service as a hoplite, private, third class, with shield and sword. There are many conflicting accounts of Socrates' life, but one thing everyone seems to agree upon is his appearance. Socrates was one of the ugliest men in Athens. He had spindly bow legs, a paunch, his shoulders and neck were hairy, and he was bald. His pate was said to be knobbly. He was also famous for his broad, snub nose, bulging eyes, and protruding lips. Socrates not only looked like a philosopher, he dressed like one. Winter and summer he invariably wore the same shabby tunic, together with a threadbare half-length cloak, and no matter the weather, he always went about barefoot. According to his colleague Antiphon the sophist, a slave made to live in this fashion would have run away. Yet, despite